super happy to have Lance Matthews from Dell come meet with us. I had a chance to meet Lance was it a year ago now, I think, Lance, when we first got a chance to meet? And learned a lot from my time there, one of which was just how extensive.
It was,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think it was right out a year ago.
Yeah. And I had the pleasure of working with Dell from my time at Microsoft. I used to run the server business, and Dell was my #1 server hardware partner at the time. So I thought I knew a lot about Dell, but just spending 30 minutes with Lance and my eyes opened up just to really how extensive Dell's reach is into the enterprise. And then Lance had a great suggestion around setting up an enterprise architect day, which is something we continue to work on, even still it's been a year. But anyhow, I approached Aaron and said, I think Lance has got a lot to share and lots for us to all learn from. And here we are today. So with that, Lance, I'd like to turn it over to you to introduce yourself. If you had any slides you wanted to walk through, you're welcome to do that, or we'll just go straight into a Q&A after your introduction, if you like.
Yeah, no, that's great. I started creating slides, and then it dawned on me that when you're doing these virtual meetings, as soon as you put up slides, people's pictures become this big, and it takes a very impersonal meeting and makes it super impersonal. So I decided not to do that.
Okay.
My background's not that exciting that you need to read it and hear it at the same time. So I'll kind of give the but literally, I have been in the communication sector since I was 7. I'm not exaggerating. My grandfather worked for Bell in Dallas. My dad was a phone man, and literally he figured out, I became his first robot. I was 7 years old, and he was needing to pull cable through a building or through a ceiling, and he would tie 25 pair of Amphenol cable onto my belt loop and tell me that I could go run through, Exxon, literally Exxon's building and help him pull cable. I thought it was fun. I saved him many man hours, and then I became his free labor until I finally figured out I had to get out of the house. So I've literally, started kind of inter-exchange carrier. IXC, ended up at Nortel, great company, not so great at balancing their books. Everybody knows how that story went. But we had the great thing about Nortel is you got exposure, running the business, running the sales operations that I was. You got exposure to kind of every side of the business from, with the Bay Network side, we thought we were, Cisco 2.0, probably weren't, but that was the what we told ourselves. Then we had the transport business, and then kind of the early days of how you build services, how you use applications to build services across, the operator community. Ended up at Ericsson, kind of had an interesting play in Ericsson, and I was running businesses that were sort of the non-radio businesses, if you will. That sounded like a really cool idea when you come in, but anytime you're in a big company, and I must be a glutton for punishment because now I'm trying to do the same thing at Dell, but you're trying to build businesses that are adjacent to the core business. Ericsson's clearly a radio company, and the closer to the radio you are, the more successful they are. They have a lot of great businesses there, by the way, but just in general, when you have to understand what the core of a company is when you're trying to do those businesses. Wanted to went to I wouldn't call it a startup. It was a 30-year-old startup, Metaswitch, London-based company, phenomenal software engineering-based company. They were acquired by Microsoft. So we had that successful exit. During that process, Dell had reached out to me about this new business that they were trying to build. And I'll kind of get into why we're doing that in some of the questioning. But in that process, you're kind of left with, okay, I'm going into Microsoft, not exactly sure how that's going to go. You don't know when you get acquired, or you've got, a company that, is sort of asking you to come in where you feel like you maybe could control your own destiny. So it's just kind of a career decision. But obviously the culture and the assets that Dell brings to the party are super interesting, super fun, with the relevancy that we have, not only within the communication and media companies, but all the way out to, the enterprises itself. I mean, there's very few companies around the world. I bet it's single-digit percentage of the companies around the world that don't have a relationship with Dell at some level. And so that's an extremely powerful proposition when you're being tasked with how do you build new revenues with the carriers at the edge, monetize 5G, ways of monetizing 4G, and how do you do that? I mean, it's not going to be with faster Facebook, on an iPhone. So, that enterprise intersection became really appealing, and so I've been here now about 18 months. So anyway, it's been an extremely fun journey, and as I was joking as I was joining the call, we've got 6.5 days left of our quarter, and so to get to talk about things like this is a very exciting break compared to looking at the latest version of a sheet. So that's the other non-fun when you work for a public company. And I see several of my team members on the call, and I hope in the background they are working on the quarter and not listening to me, because they've heard all of my stick.
So, so Lance, let's go back from the time that you were in the telco business at the age of 7 to now. I haven't been in it as long as you have by a long stretch, but what it feels like to me, and I ask this of all of our roundtable speakers, is that 5G is an entirely new and different playbook for the carriers and for enterprises than we've seen being played out before in 4G, 3G, 2G, and 1G. And I sort of discount 1G and 2G because it was really the early days of telecommunications. 3G, we really started to dip into data. 4G was the mobile revolution. 5G is so much different. I'd love to get your perspective on why you think it's different, and then some of the things that Dell's been investing in behind around some of that difference and where those intersections play out.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm not going to answer it from a technical perspective because I think everybody has that perspective. I'm going to you from a different angle.
Okay.
We think about it from a data gravity perspective. If you go back to the very early days of compute, you've got mainframes and terminals.
Yep.
So the data is literally as close to the user as you can get, and then it swings with the advent of PCs, servers, internet, the whole Wintel, type of business that was created. That's really when Dell sort of inserted themselves in the business. That swing created 10x the amount of data. And then as it swings back to more of a hyperscale environment, Dell has done okay in that world. I mean, we sell a fair amount of servers to the hyperscale guys, but that's not our core domain, clearly. So, but when you go back to where that pendulum started to swing, our core business of storage, server, client, that's our core business. And so, there were some decisions that were made in the company well preceding me about how much of the business is going to move to the hyperscale versus not and whatever. But as that starts to swing back into my favorite 4-letter word, edge, and I talk about edge almost all day, and the way that I describe it, because people try to overcomplicate what it is. It's not a product, it's a place. And place requires network at some level. It requires compute, storage, it requires all of those kind of things. And then these kick-ass applications that are providing value to an enterprise. The value that created, the carrier, Dell, most that are on the call today that are making things, we're part of the value chain that's there, but the value that's actually created is for what that enterprise is trying to do with it. And that requires a set of platforms underneath and network connectivity. And everybody loves to talk about private mobility, and I'm sure we'll talk about that today because it's kind of the the thing that's on everyone's mind. But whether it's fiber fed or wireless or whatever, as long as you can let those applications find their ground. Some things are just naturally going to run better in a hyperscale. You're not going to stand up a new website and run it at the edge. Like, there's no point. You're not going to, your CRM data doesn't necessarily need to be at the edge. Salesforce can live where it lives. But on the other hand, the data that's created there, that's creating that value at the edge, that's what we have to think through. How do you create that value for that enterprise user or for those developers, for those lines of business that they need to solve for? So when you think about what 5G enables, that's the biggest one, because the billions and billions of dollars that are being invested in infrastructure, in spectrum, revamping operations and processes and all of those things all of those things are a means to the end. The end is you've got to create a business construct and a business value that's there. And as I sort of joked a while ago, selling, an iPhone 16 with streaming fast Facebook, consumers have shown they're not going to pay more for that.
Yeah.
And so it really is, you have to use these technologies as a way to monetize with enterprises. Now, you could make some arguments around consumer as well. There's a lot of movement, and we have a business inside of Dell. I'm not very, close to it, but the Alienware business where gaming is going to be really big, but clearly those consumption models are going to be very different in the way that they're rolled out. But there is a consumer play for sure, but it's not going to be just a mobility play. That's kind of played out. That's created its lane.
Yeah. One of the goals that I try to use these forums for, Lance, is to get like the insider's perspective, and you're doing a fantastic job of sharing that with us. You tripped off an idea though in my head. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. The edge is not a place, right? It's really a construction of services for applications to get closer to the users, right? And we have many teams that are actually building capabilities that will harness the capabilities expected on the edge. So that said, what's the insider perspective that you're seeing around how enterprises are considering the edge as part of their IT strategy going forward? Is it safe to say it's not, it's not just a, hey, this is going to be utopia and great, or this is like, no, they're actually investing in these capabilities because these are, important capabilities for use cases they're investing behind?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really is the key question in this value chain as we try to understand. There's some use cases that are really simple to understand. A mine that's in a super area or an oil rig that's offshore.
Yeah.
When you've got data that's created in an area like that, you can't go back to, some data center wherever that's going to introduce a lot of cost from an egress perspective, but also, just the latency challenges that don't allow it to be there. But back to the data gravity, it really is around the technical characteristics. That's usually like latency and the amount of compute and storage and all of those kind of things, security, and then cost. And so these enterprises, as they grapple with this, that's what's on their mind. Are we seeing investments there? We absolutely are. Let me separate my business that I have with the kind of communications and media companies with a minute to what we're more broadly across Dell. And just for clarification, business that we have inside of my team is kind of bifold. It's the business that we actually sell to them that they use for their internal consumption, as well as the businesses that we build with them that we take out to the market to the enterprises, jointly. So we have responsibility for the success of both. The enterprises more largely, though, we are seeing retail and manufacturing is really starting to accelerate. This is announced publicly, so I'll talk about it. But Lowe's has gone. The average enterprise has 2.2 data centers, and now all of a sudden, like Lowe's is pushing out edge nodes to all 1,800 locations. I mean, those are the kind of things that are happening, and they're to create a next gen. Which is an overused term, but to kind of create that next gen retail environment, you have to push that out.
Yeah.
Now, what they're grappling with is they obviously had a business case to do that, but now how do you take that to another level? How do you able store and actually, and I hope everybody's frozen, so I hope you're able to still hear me.
We can hear you.
So we're seeing that,
Yeah. You're cutting in and out. Sorry about that, Lance. You're cutting in and out, but you're
back.
Yeah.
It's an edge.
The first edge use case that I'd like AT&T Uverse here in my neighborhood to
help with
experience.
So way back in the day, and I'm predating myself, we used to call what Lowe's is doing branch computing, but what you're describing, Lance, isn't branch computing. And so it begs the question, right? The application models that were deployed in branch were first apps on servers, right? Like apps on bare metal, all managed remotely. And then it went to VMs on metal, still managed remotely. How's the application architecture changing now in the case of a Lowe's, without breaking into any confidentiality? But it feels like it's a highly microservices, Kubernetes-led world, centralized management back in the data center. But those branch instances, or now these edge instances, are essentially flexible architectures that could spin up and spin down depending on that particular store's demands. Is that the right way of thinking about how Lowe's is architecting this?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're right. I'm not going to double click into Lowe's specifically, because that would be a little bit. I don't even know where I could go there without
Sure. No,
getting
generalizations
myself in
are
trouble.
fine. Yeah,
So this is not a Lowe's comment. I use
yeah,
them just as purely as an analogy. But no, everything that we're seeing. I mean, I take a step back. I can't say everything that we're seeing. Some of the things that we're building for are, oddly enough, it's a little bit of a surprise to me. Actually, I didn't expect this, but I was in a meeting earlier this week with a customer who's got a robotics company, and not to get into too much of that, but they're still building 3-tier architectures, building it at the edge, connecting it with high-speed access. I'll kind of leave it generic that way, but it's still based on VMs, which was actually kind of a surprise to me. But that one is purely because what they've tried to do within the hyperscale environment, they literally just can't reach the technical limitation. When you've got robots that are needing to do things in real time, it just didn't work. But to try to rebuild their entire application stack, with Kubernetes as an example, just was an insurmountable sort of cost structure for them. But in general, while there are some sort of edge cases, like, I couldn't call it an edge, but kind of some individual cases like that, the vast majority of everything that we're seeing is very microservices driven. We're not even looking at how to push VMs out. It's all Kubernetes.
yeah,
And if you're thinking about building, pushing this out, I like the branch analogy. Actually, there's nothing that's new. It's just we call it a new name because
yep,
it gets customers willing to spend money and investors to to buy our stock. But it actually is what's old is new, and all of that stuff. But
yeah.
it's very much, Kubernetes is at the core of everything that we're doing. And how do you think about enabling with EKS or AKS or whatever that particular enterprise is needing to do? If you can't build with that in mind from the get-go, you eliminate yourself before you finish the first conversation.
Yep. Now, going back to not Lowe's, but going back to companies that are moving more infrastructure out to the edge, there's been this raging debate about the effectiveness and reliability of Wi-Fi, despite even Wi-Fi 6 and some of the gains there. And there's been a lot more interest in private cellular, maybe in some cases 4G LTE standards, but in future cases, clearly 5G. And all the look-sees that I've been doing into the market suggest that this is sort of a here to stay market opportunity. Private enterprise cellular networking is. And it's not because of just the cellular connectivity, it's because of the capabilities we just talked about, Lance, which is moving more applications dynamically on the edge, having the flexibility to ramp up and scale down depending on
Yeah.
use cases as well. I'd love to get your perspective. I ask this of all of our corporate partners as well. Like what are you seeing in private enterprise networking, and what are the insights you can share in terms of how the CXO levels or even the IT managers are considering these investments?
It's a great question. So one, I'm going to caveat it by, I as I talk to the product executives across many of these carriers, um, from Latin America to Canada, and it's all of them kind of end up at the same point, but in terms of what it is that they're trying to do, and then it's just a matter of figuring out how to execute against that. But I tell them all the time, listen, whether you're talking to somebody from a cable background or a wireline DSL background, I use the same analogy, which is if an enterprise wants to buy DSL from you and you want to sell them an MPLS connection or an SD-WAN connection, don't not sell them the DSL connection, number one. So if an enterprise is stepping into this slowly because of economics and other things, and they need to start with why, don't eliminate your seat at the table.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I tell them. what these enterprises need is companies that understand how to manage networks on behalf of you. You sell your business is you sell monthly recurring services. Don't eliminate your business just because you want to sell something else. And that resonates pretty well with them. The truth is, we all understand the the technical attributes of what private mobility brings over Wi-Fi. I'm not gonna try to debate that with anybody. I mean, you guys know it as well as I do. The business reality is there comes a point in time, and it's usually driven. What I've seen is if it's a layer of mobility that's needed that Wi-Fi is not good at. You guys know that, but it really comes down to security.
Yeah.
Is the security in the application critical that you need a PAL license or you need something that you can carve out and protect? That's where the conversation comes into play. I'll use an example. Just it's one of the best ones that helps you really think about it. There's an amusement park company we're working with. You all know them, so I won't get into the name, but you can kind of connect the dots, but that's okay. But there's an amusement park company that we're working with. And the reason that I got personally involved is I started to figure out that what an amusement park is a bunch of small factories and a bunch of retail. I know that sounds crazy, but play with me along. So you've got a ride and an attraction that's got this highly automated machine that's moving around. And then you've got a bunch of stores, inside of this park, right? When we started working with them, and at first they tried to do all of this on Wi-Fi, and I'm not religious. I'm not in the radio business. I'm not religious around, oh, you've got to use this spectrum, or you got to do this, or you got to do that. I mean, we're just trying to help the customer be successful in their outcome, right?
Yep.
Ultimately, what they figured out is rides move too fast for Wi-Fi, number one. And number two, the thing that you cannot have a ride do is harm a human.
Yeah.
Human safety. It's literally like robots in a factory. You can't have a ride that's moving. So you've got cameras from all these different angles that are looking for, is everything where it's supposed to be? And all of a sudden you've got an autonomous vehicle, let's call it a roller coaster if you want, that's moving at 40 miles an hour and a human that's moving at 4 miles an hour. And are they going to impact? And if they are, what do you do?
Yep.
So that literally, we end up putting edge clouds in every single attraction. And I'm calling it an edge cloud, just kind of a generic term. And the only way to solve that was with, a private network overlay. And that's the way that we were able to solve it. Now, once you start doing that, then you start doing the math of going, well, wait a minute, they're an amusement park. What they want as much as anything is the people inside there to be TikToking and telling all their friends how great this is.
Yep.
So now you've got an opportunity with one or more carriers to create a much better experience from the mobile, and you're literally getting free advertising because you've got, some super cool person, the Instagram model, that's riding around on a ride talking about how awesome this is. And then they move into a store and they're telling you about this isn't here yet, but these, you want to try on all these different shirts, you can stand in front of a mirror and you can change the shirt that you're wearing, without actually having to try them on, and you can see yourself, and, all of these kind of things that they're dreaming up. I mean, an amusement park, the thing that's cool about them is they have these hyper creative people that can think through these things. And so it became a very great use case for my team and I to really work with them, because now you can start to visualize the things that we talk about and why these certain technologies are the only way to support them. Those are the kind of things that we're seeing. Hospitals is another one. We had a conversation with one of the carriers recently where, their base stations surrounding hospitals are running red hot. And the only thing that those base stations are doing are streaming. Like 80% of the traffic is TikTok. It's people sitting in waiting rooms or sitting in a hospital bed, bored stiff. And so their ability to monetize those mobile networks are limited by that. Just offload those with a DAS or private mobility inside, and then you unlock all of these new kind of healthcare type of things that we can do. I mean, I'm not going to get into all the apps unless you want to, but
Yep.
those are some of the business cases that we're starting to see where the intersection of how to offload some of the existing business and make those experiences better and the ability to do the new. That's as cases start to get really, really interesting for both the enterprise and the carrier and how they invest together to solve those things.
Excellent. So on that note, I wanted to ask a follow-up question, but before I do, for any of the startups or even other partners on the call today, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'd love to, take you up on that. So my follow-up question for you, Lance, is you're on the front lines, proverbially seeing these new use cases and these opportunities come up. And you and your team also work with a host of CSPs. And so just yesterday, we had Tejas Rao from Accenture speaking, and I asked Tejas, given your preview and yourself, given your preview across all these CSPs, what would you say CSPs are doing to really evaluate the monetization opportunities? Because you're right, there is upside in some of the consumer piece, but really the holy grail of opportunities is going to be the enterprise, and a lot of them are placing a lot of little bets in different areas. So before Vikram, we go to your question, I'd love to get your perspective, Lance, on that and what you're seeing CSPs try out in terms of new monetization in enterprise.
Yeah, this is the the one question that I was worried about because since I have all the CSPs, I love them all. Just in case somebody's recording,
Yeah.
they're all great. They're all fantastic partners. There's kind of, I'm going to break the CSPs into two categories. And I'm not going to name names.
Okay.
There are some that have incredibly mature enterprise businesses or incredibly mature, processes and sales teams around how to go capture this. Fundamentally, they sell broadband. That's what they know how to do.
Yeah.
Wireless broadband, wired broadband, that's what they know how to do. They're really, really good at it. Companies like Dell sell infrastructure. When I'm going to kind of take a side note. I'm going to come back to your question. When we start our enablement processes of how we work together in the field,
yeah,
we focus that on not trying to get an operator person to understand, what a server or storage device does or doesn't do, or, why mine is better than somebody else's. It's really around, you have to go understand when you're talking to an enterprise buyer, which is typically somebody in their IT shop, what is their customer need? Their line of business, their developers, what do they need? If you can understand how to solve the problem for your customer's customer, your chances of success are much, much better.
Yep.
The business case is going to be crisper. The technology solution is going to be much better. Some carriers that we work with get that really quick. They understand it. Some of them a little bit harder. We have seen, I would even argue that, and this is not a knock on anybody because I would say the exact same thing about Dell. CSPs by definition are not innovators. That's not life. Same with Dell. Our business is, we have a $105 billion a year business. It's about managing. What we do incredibly well is, we know how to get point solutions to a point. We have an incredibly good supply chain, blah, 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 blah. That's how we do it. We can service any physical device with spare parts in 4 hours, pretty much in any zip code in the world. That's our core domain. Carriers are good at delivering network. So when you start to think about how they're thinking about this from an innovative standpoint, I'm not sure that I would frame it exactly that way.
Yep.
What we have seen some carriers do really well is embrace companies like the ones that are, some of the companies that are represented here today, companies like Accenture or others, and really understand how to take the depth and the breadth of the market challenges that need to be solved. If you want to, the way that I think through it, when I'm sitting across the table from a carrier, if they're trying to figure out how to solve a problem for their customer, there's a high likelihood we're going to figure out how to get some really good stuff done. On the other hand, if everything is they're trying to hit a new revenue target next quarter or next year, they're probably not going to get there, at least in the timing that they want. More specifically, the things that you're, I understand the crux of the real question. We've seen some carriers, like I'll use Rogers as an example. It's one that we've publicly announced, so I can talk about it openly with names, where Rogers went and found a real use case where you have a gold mine, literal, not figurative, a gold mine in the middle of Western Canada. There's no network there. There's no coverage there. And they've got all of these autonomous vehicles, and it takes 2 hours for an autonomous vehicle to get from the top of the mine to the bottom of the mine. And let's say you want to put so one, you need to know where all of those are. Again, back to my amusement park analogy a while ago, the number one thing is you can't let humans get hurt.
Yep.
So that's the number one thing. You got these cameras in all these places. You got a truck moving at this pace. You got a human moving at this pace. The truck's got to stop, right? So that's the number one use case. But then you get into optimize the weights and all of those things. Or if you need a tool at the bottom, you put a tool on a truck that's autonomously driving to the bottom, and then it gets down there, it's the wrong tool. Well, now wireless network that's been built. In that particular one, again, this is all public, so you can go look. Ericsson radios, Expedo was the core. Everybody loves to talk about mech. I remind people all the time, Dell doesn't make mechs. We make an edge computer, an edge cloud. The carrier brings the access. That's how you get to mech.
Yep.
So, the Expedo and Dell kind of made that. We made this application-ready framework, and then all of that data is able to sit there and be acted on in real time. So there are some companies that are really looking for dividing up the market and then finding technology solutions to solve a market problem. Some companies are doing really, really well with that. Some companies are just trying to run old plays.
Yeah, makes sense. That Kirkland Lakes Gold was a great use case, and as you mentioned, Expedo was powering some of that from our first batch. Vikram, you had a question?
Yeah. So Matthew, super helpful. So really interesting, because just a couple of days ago, I read a really interesting article in Enterprise Insights by actually one of your colleagues on, basically the headline was "Make Your Plans to Incorporate 5G." And I think it was written by your colleague, Marco. But it's really interesting because Dell and a lot of companies have made into how 5G is so critical to many of our so-called Industrial 4.0 plans. But that said, in my year and a half, specifically as running Shibodi in the space, we've come across several enterprises deploying 5G, but whether it's a Bosch, a Volkswagen, John Deere, they're all what they've announced publicly and what's in reality, where most of them are still maybe maximum 10, 12 sites. It's more pilot project based and actually full deployment. So in your opinion, what will it take? And still with most of the enterprises, at least I speak with, there's a curiosity and interest in 5G, specifically a lot of CIOs, but there's, in terms of actually what to do with it outside of getting more performance for legacy applications, they're still struggling what we call that next generation use case. And that's when I like your Kirkland Gold example. But just further on, why do you think there's still such a divergence with a lot of these enterprise CIOs in terms of what they can do with 5G, and why when you have players like Accenture, Dell, why is it still so hard? Is it a timing issue, or it's a knowledge issue, or it's both, and it'll happen? It just hasn't happened yet.
Well, I'll start by saying if I knew how to solve that exactly, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys. I would be building my Mark Zuckerberg empire.
All right. I don't feel so bad anymore then.
So I genuinely wish I knew that. Look, jokes aside, I'll give you my opinion, but I also remind you of, Jim did a very good job at the beginning of the call of describing for you that I'm actually quite old, that I've been doing this for a really long time.
Oh, sorry.
So, without calling me old and calling me out, he did reference I've been doing this for a long time. So I've seen these adoption cycles, and we all understand it. But I mentioned that I work for an inter-exchange carrier, and when I was working for them, we had an opportunity. They literally, at the time, we could have gotten pretty wide swaths of 800 megahertz spectrum in some certain areas of the country that they couldn't find any bidders for. And we literally had a conversation as a management team. I was in my 20s, and so I was maybe I get a mulligan for being so. but we literally were sitting around in the room like, how many people are really going to drive around with a phone? So, this cycle has repeated itself many times over. I remember in the early days of 4G, I was at Ericsson at the time, and we were bringing people in to different internal forums and management forums and whatever, and trying to figure out, why can't we get people to adopt this? And we were trying to think of everything. Like we worked with some camera company, like news camera company, I don't remember who it was, and we literally figured out, hey, we can build a LTE modem that goes on the, and they can stream it straight back to the video, straight back to the TV, and they wouldn't need a satellite truck and all that. I mean, we're trying to solve a problem based on our knowledge of where the market was at that time. If we would have just had the to understand that, hey, if we can get Facebook to move from the home PC to the mobile device, adoption, do that. Like, we didn't understand that. We're in that same part of that cycle, is the first thing I would tell you. People understand the technology. And it's also why I think it's really important for all of us to understand, when you're talking to somebody in IT, they've got the same, they don't know either. But if you can talk to their business owners about what it is that they need to be successful for, and ultimately how much money they have, or what is the financial opportunity if they're able to be successful, then you can start going backwards. It's the reason why I tell the carriers all the time, don't ignore Wi-Fi. Let the technologies start to take off, and then the money will sort itself out. The secure, all of those attributes will come into play. I just are going to be conservative, and you've got, you've traditionally got, a batch of engineers that are saying, hey, I really want to go solve this, and I just need $1 million. And that's a hard conversation to have with a CFO until you've got some proof points that you can see. But we're seeing it start to happen. We're starting to see that acceleration, and it's not going to be an overnight thing. I don't overnight thing when the hyperscale world came out. It just takes time, but the more we can understand what those lines of businesses need to achieve financially, the P&L owners in the business and the developers, the developer communities, what they're trying to solve to meet those financial objectives, the more we understand that, the better the chances are we have to be successful. And honestly, like, I hate to say it, but I almost think it's more important to understand a few of those people that we know and respect, that we think really understand things. I think it's almost more important to understand how they're thinking than how the carriers are thinking, because the carriers are trying to build, they're trying to build an overall business at scale, but it's steps along the way in the journey. Hopefully that helps. Great question, Mel.
Oh, no, thank you.
Charles, thank you, Vikram. Charles, did you have a question?
Yeah, I really like that analogy of amusement park is really a bunch of factories with retail. And I was just wondering if you had some other analogies like that, where you take an ecosystem like an amusement park and broke it down to something as simple as factories and retail. Is there other things that you could reference?
Yeah, Charles, I use that one because it's I'm not smart enough to understand the whole market, and it's, like, oh, okay, so if you do this in a Transformers ride, oh, I see, I get it. Just brings it to light. I like the analogy just because it brings it to life. Other ones that I could, think of, we talk about an oil rig offshore and all the, the human safety attributes that you need, plus all the telemetry that's coming off that. How do you act on that? How are you, if you can, when you start to think about some of the things like AI could give you as you're seeing all these data and you're looking in patterns of, like probably the two worst things that you could have in an offshore oil rig are, number one, human safety, but two would be a spill or something like that. And how do you get data where you can, really act on it locally? But an oil rig is an easy one just because you can picture it in your head. I mean, it's literally in the middle of the ocean. So other analogies that I could think of. I mean, the KLG one, obviously you guys are super familiar with it, but just because it is a gold mine, a literal one, not just a figurative one. We all think Edge is going to be a figurative gold mine, or we hope so. That's the reason we're here. Yeah, nothing else is coming to mind, Charles. Sorry, I'll think of one.
No, but you got me, and hopefully other people thinking that if we can boil it down in our heads to simple things like factories, retail, blah blah blah, then it's an amusement park is now a market segment that's no different than a factory.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and it's also one that that has a little bit of a license to be creative and money to be creative, which is why I traditionally don't personally go out to every individual enterprise site because I physically can't, but or even participate virtually. But that's one, once I got my head around that, actually seeing it was just really valuable.
Yeah, Charles, this is Kurt. One of the ways I think about this is that you have to focus on solving a real problem, right? And I know that sounds pedantic, but it's the accumulation of a number of solutions to customer problems that ultimately make a market. You can't chase the market, right? You got to go solve a problem. The market will develop as multiple problems get solved that have alignment of technology and platforms.
Very well said, Kurt. Thanks.
Yeah.
Raj, did you have a question then, James, right after?
No, I was just going to ask Matthew about the Apex program and how does that play into the Edge? If you could comment on that, that would be useful.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we all understand the general attributes of a subscription-based model in terms of how you manage life cycle, how you environments. In the traditional sense, Dell has been shipping gear out in a very perpetual based model for a long time. It's traditionally how, and by the way, carriers for their own use, Apex is a bit of a bad word because their financial models, as many of you that are trying to sell to carriers will know, they want everything in a perpetual CapEx based license, which doesn't always align with the world. For the enterprises, they have become very conditioned to the hyperscale model, and I'm talking about financial model, not technical model. So enterprises have become very, accustomed to that. It's a pay by the drink, it's a pay, success-based model, and so Apex became super important in that enterprise business. Early on, I actually didn't think Apex was going to be very important to the operator space. That's changed though significantly. Again, not for their own internal consumption reasons, but when they're taking a business model out to an enterprise and they're selling access plus, maybe our Edge platform or whatever, those enterprises, what the carrier's selling is a monthly recurring service. So having something that significantly increases the ability for that enterprise to use the platform is really helpful. It adds a significant amount of predictability into the cost structure of that. I mean, now you can see linearly as I use this is my cost model with the carrier model because they charge on a monthly recurring basis. So it aligns their cost with the enterprise's success. So from that perspective, we've seen it go really well. Now we also have, Apex is kind of more of a brand than an actual product. But we also, we do a lot of work where I'm just going to say it, creative financial models. I used the word financial engineering the other day on a call, and somebody asked me if I was talking about Enron. I said, no, I never sold Enron, but I did sell to WorldCom. So I've got experience with that too. But no, where you can, we can take some of the risk on for the carrier, because a lot of and we're having the conversation here. We're all trying to figure out how this is going to be solved, and what is the time period, and is the business value going to be in the in the first year that you deploy something, or is it really going to be spread out over 2 or 3 years? And how as Dell can we sort of help that end customer manage that risk? So Apex is becoming a much more part of our daily conversations with customers than we expected, but it's more on that side, not on their internal consumption, because they're, they love to write billion-dollar checks and convince Wall Street that it was a great deal.
Thank you for that. James, do you have a question from Privify?
Yeah, it's a little loud here, so I'll keep it brief. It wasn't so much a question as an observation. You're talking about the entertainment parks, the theme parks. The factory side, the ride, the kinetic side of the business also falls under a completely different security model from, it's an OT product at that point. And one of the things that I've been seeing a lot in the marketplace is, almost 2 decades of development for the so-called Purdue security model, where you get multiple layers of isolation and from kinetic equipment and data collection and business systems, and they're all isolated networks from each other. And all of that's kind of anathema for introducing MEC and edge compute, because remotely provisioning workloads into those kinds of security environments, it's explicitly forbidden by the model, and the model is buried in regulation in some countries, like in Germany, where your factory's got to comply to the standard I have in mind is IEC 62443. And so the IT side of it, where you might believe that you've got security covered, and the OT side, where safety comes even before security, they're completely different worldviews, and bridging those two is I think one of the tricks of the day. So it's more of an observation than a question. I know that Dell is working on both sides of that equation, but actually, Lance, maybe do you have any observations on that you might be able to share?
Well, I will start with the fact that I'm not a trained engineer, so I'm not going to try to answer that in a purely technical sense. What I can say, or how I would comment with confidence, is we view part of our place in the ecosystem is bridging those divides. The way that carriers build, operate, secure is sometimes different, and there's part of that is political. You mentioned that there's regulatory aspects that are different. Sometimes it's different markets. We all hate that. When you've got a particular market that Europe has got different privacy standards than we have here in the U.S. as an example. But but part of what Dell believes that we can bring to the market is an ability to sort of normalize that, to make these solutions more consumable. Because if you don't solve for both, you end up with nowhere. But the specific standard that you referenced, I don't have an opinion on, just to be honest.
Thank you, James, for that. Lance, I could go on for another hour, but one of the questions I wanted to ask of you, and this is to benefit our startups. Dell's a very different business from the early days of Michael building PCs out of the back of his car to the configurator days that I remembered to where it is today. And having joined Dell, not recently, but within the last couple of years, what are some aspects to Dell that you think are misunderstood in the market, and what feedback, or not feedback, rather, what advice would you give the teams, the startups, in terms of how to think about Dell as a partner?
So on the first one, you're absolutely right. Well, even when I was mentioning, I guess it was a couple years ago or whatever, when we were exiting Metaswitch into Azure, and Dell called me, I was like, well, why do you need my help selling mouse pads and monitors? I don't, right. What can I do there? And right. I hate that this is recorded. I hope that doesn't find its way to Twitter. But no, I mean, so what Dell is remarkably good at is taking complex value chains and launching them to scale.
Yep.
Just take the Michael Dell and out, the story that you just referenced, where he literally started building, he started building PCs in his University of Texas dormitory into, what it is today. But really what he did was he identified a market that needed help, that operationally you could deliver at scale. And their original business was you log on to Dell.com, or you call the rep and you tell them how much RAM you need and the size of your hard drive, and 2 days later it showed up on your front door. And just that ability to drive things at scale, I've never seen a machine that could operate like that. Now, the second part of your question is the hard one, because big companies, and that's why I kind of look at Dell the same way that I would an AT&T or companies like that. It's big companies, but to manage a big company, you've got a lot of process, you've got a lot of, I hate the word bureaucracy, but maybe that's the right way to think about it. And so the ability to be successful, I mean, we're kind of, we call ourselves a startup inside of a big company. By the way, I don't think that really exists, but it sounds cool. Is how do you manage what we do so well to solve a problem? Well, in this industry, as things disaggregate further out to the edge, we have a lot of assets that we bring to bear there. Like I mentioned earlier, we're putting thousands and thousands of servers literally at the bottom of cell sites now. And so you really have these like micro data centers at the bottom of a cell site, if you want to think about them like that. Companies can do that. There's nothing magic about, how you bend metal around, chips and put, accelerator cards in and whatever. There's a lot of companies that can do that. But how many of them can actually, that have enough trucks and people on the street that in a 4-hour, because remember, carriers got to get to 5 nines reliability. Part of that is the failure rates of the equipment. That's a big part of it, and the software and all of that, right? But also part of it is you're going to have a power supply go down. And how quickly can you get a human out there on site at the right cost structure to replace a power supply? So while that doesn't sound super sexy, those are the type of capabilities that we have. We have this massive engineering organization in ISG that takes complex things, like Red Hat or Wind River and VMware and, on and on and on. I could kind of, all the partnerships that we have, and there's tons of ISVs that we work with, and managing that complexity and the partner ecosystem and all of that to ultimately bring a solution to the customer. What makes Dell, Bob Gessel emailed me earlier, told me somebody from Ericsson's on, so I won't talk about Ericsson. But when I worked for Ericsson, the way we viewed partnerships was, hey, you're a little company, you go sit in the corner and I'll tell you when I need you. That's not how Dell works. I mean, Dell's literally built the entire business from, we partner with Microsoft and Intel from the very beginning. I mean, that's how the company started. So it's always been about partner ecosystems that deliver to a market at scale. So that's how I would challenge you to think about it. How to work with Dell or other companies, and listen, I do have some experience with this. Metaswitch was, small company. We were privately held, so 800 people, pure software company, trying to figure out how to get people's attention. It's hard. The best way I can tell you is, if you're just trying to full on sell into Dell or into a carrier, it's pretty hard unless you can point to, these are the customers or the segment that we can win. The technology can be the best thing ever, but Dell and carriers and companies of our size and structure are not innovative by nature, because that's not what we solve in the market. That's what you solve in the market. You bring the innovation engine. So the best advice I could give you when you're talking to somebody in a Dell or into a carrier, it's how do you solve a problem quickly, and it's got to be financially backed, not technology backed, because people aren't always going to see the technology. They're going to see the sponsorships that you need inside of a Dell or inside of a carrier are business people generally. So, that's my best advice. I lived through that, and almost, and I was at Meta, and, so I've got some experience there. I know how hard it is. I know how hard it is to, we partnered a lot with Cisco when I was at Meta, and it was hard to be, viewed as relevant. But if you can put it in business terms that people can consume and understand, your chances of success are much higher.
Well said. Lance, thank you so much for a great session. I was texting back and forth with Aaron, spewing out my fantastic comments about how great this session was. It really truly was. And so I appreciate you spending some time with us today. If it's not a bother, we'd love to invite you back for a future session. And it's likely
Absolutely.
that some people will want to follow up with Dell directly on comments just from today alone. But hey, thank you so much for spending time with us. It was really enlightening.
Yeah, no, and anybody needs to ping me, lance.matthews@dell.com, not hard, 2 T's. Happy to help. I'm not going to promise I can get you exactly where you want to go, but as an industry, we need the innovation and the ideas and the things that you're bringing. Without it, we won't get off the ground. And so, I love what you're doing. I hope I hope everybody on here, continued success, and look forward to seeing you probably in an airport somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you. And we'll get you a T-Mobile fixed wireless access point for your home so you get some better connectivity, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'll.
Hey, Lance.
So at my other house, I do have a T-Mobile fixed access point, and I went through the effort. You can go watch these videos on Reddit, but on how to, I put a MIMO antenna on the outside, and I actually get much better throughput in the middle of rural Oklahoma at my lake house than I get in Dallas on AT&T. So
there you go.
True story. So
there you go.
All right,
well,
guys.
Hey, thank you so much. Have a
all.
great rest of your day. We appreciate it. Cheers.
See you guys.
See you. Bye.
Great. Thank you.